Well, for those of you who have attended lectures here at the Kennedy Center before, Dodge Billingsley is almost sort of a fixture. He has been involved in so many interesting projects over the years that we try to implore him to come and spend some time with us as much as he can. Recently, you'll note that Dodge is the president of Combat Films and Research and also a documentary film producer and director. He's been involved in a number of very interesting projects. Some of his independent projects include Swift Company, Marines Engaged in West Africa, and Virgin Soldiers, just to name a few. In the last few years, his time has been taken up by a joint project with the Kennedy Center of a film series called Beyond the Border. The second viewing of those films just finished last week on KBYU Channel 11. And that includes a number of films dealing with such diverse topics as Chinese social realist art and the Cultural Revolution, to Ukraine in the post-Soviet era, to the fog of war in Iraq, titled Fog and Friction, but it's about the fog of war. Dodge has a degree from Columbia University and a master's degree in war studies from London's King's College. Today he will be speaking on the other war, nation building in Africa. He is particularly qualified to discuss this as he was one of just a few Americans present at the prison uprising in Mazar-e-Sharif where CIA agent Spam was killed. He has a habit of traveling to some of the most dangerous places on the planet and has, again, makes very interesting films to tell the story of it. Please join with me in welcoming today Dodge Billingsley.
Whoa. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Away from this mic, so maybe I'm okay. It's good to be here today. As he mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about Afghanistan. It's something that hasn't really been touched on for a while because it seems like our attention has been in Iraq as a nation, and attention has been in Iraq and other places. So it seemed like a good time to sort of revisit. We also just sent a crew, Combat Films and Research, we sent a crew to Afghanistan 3 weeks ago. So we came back with some new footage and some new data and just some new lessons learned. So we wanted to share that with you as well. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I usually don't do PowerPoint, but I thought I'd experiment with it. So I found that while I was building on my slides, I realized I didn't really figure out what I was going to say with them. So I might pause between each one because it'll cue me as to what I'm going to do. We definitely will have time for questions and answers afterwards. But if anybody has a question in the context of it, feel free to interrupt. It's kind of informal. I'm going to turn just a couple of these lights down. Is that okay for everybody? I think we have. Okay. The title of the film, the title of the presentation, for the time being, is Nation Building in Afghanistan. Often, nation building is a dirty word around the world. In Afghanistan, particularly, there are multiple facets, aspects to this, and I've listed them for you, so you've had time to look at them now for about 10 minutes. And one is the anti-Taliban al-Qaeda operations, and the other one is to neutralize the power of the warlords and expand the reach of the central government. You can't really talk about anything in Afghanistan without getting just a quick update. This is by no means comprehensive, but look back at the history. What brought us to this point today is probably worth a few minutes. In 1989, the Soviets withdrew. An Afghan Najib takes power. He takes off. He doesn't take power. He leaves. The failure, Pakistan is not able to install a friendly government in Kabul. The U.S., we also withdraw from the region, and the civil war commences between two chief rivals, primarily Hekmatyar and Massoud. And Hekmatyar is supported by Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, primarily the United Arab Emirates. United Arab Emirates is interesting. It's a very pro-Western Gulf state, but they fund jihads. Like in Chechnya, they were the #1 supporter, financial supporter for the first war in Chechnya, 94, 96, out of the Gulf states. And then Massoud, who was backed by Russia, Iran, and India. Sorry. But in this war between these competing factions, Kabul gets destroyed. There's general chaos. There's a strong sense of desire in Pakistan as well to come up with some sort of unifying government, and this ushers in the Taliban, which was supported by Pakistan. And there's famous stories about the warlords fighting over Kabul over the sodomy of young boys, and the Taliban put an end to that, or official end to that. I mean, it was a really out of control place, and the Taliban at the time seemed like a pretty good alternative. 1998, 2001. I have a laser here, I don't know how it works.
Pull the trigger. It's like on the bottom.
Aha, okay, there it is. Here's my little map. Territory held by the Taliban. You can see they kind of took most of the country. In this center hinterland here, there were pockets, and it's probably more scattered than that, but there was no control up here. And then the Northern Alliance firmly controlled this part right here, right off Tajikistan. So that was kind of the state of the country. As you know, there were, after 9/11, the U.S. became involved in Afghanistan, and it could be highlighted probably, if you think of it, by the Rangers dropping into what became Camp Rhino, the Kandahar Air Base, conducting their night raid, the Marines landing in Camp Rhino. There was the fortress uprising at Mazar-e-Sharif as Kunduz and the rest of the country fell. There's Mazar-e-Sharif up there. You had Tora Bora, the fall of Kabul, November 2001. Tora Bora, right after that. You had Operation Anaconda, March 2002, and different things like this. But what it's really amounted to now is you have combat operations going on in 3 boxes, basically. And that's, well, there they are. It's pretty. And this is the area where Operation Anaconda was fought, and another one. But these are what they consider the last real bastions of Taliban control, or Al-Qaeda, or anti-coalition forces. And so you have active U.S. units engaging in these areas. In about 3 weeks, we're scheduled to go with SOCOM to do some operations right here at Spin Boldak, if it doesn't get canceled. Working with SOCOM, things get canceled. But we'll probably be down in this area here. These are U.S. forces. At the time, at the moment, I think there's only about 8,000 or 9,000 combat troops. I think about 12,000 troops total, U.S. forces in Afghanistan under this joint task force. But what I really want to take, and I want to just kind of give that as a intro to this. This is, you guys may recognize this guy. If you don't, we'll talk about him later. But the real thing, what I really want to talk about was this idea of neutralizing the warlords. There is a second war going on in Afghanistan, and that is reining in the power of the warlords. The guy who is responsible for this is obviously President Karzai, current president of Afghanistan. And you can see a little bit of his credentials. He's a Pashtun. I put this province, I put this little province map here, and I'm going to come to it later, but you're going to see it with all the characters. It just kind of gives you an idea of the different administrative makeup of Afghanistan. Anyway, Afghanistan is under the direction of President Karzai, but President Karzai owes his success to the United Front. The United Front was more commonly referred to as the Northern Alliance. And it was made up of 6 primary or 6 major factions, and you've probably heard of some of these before. You got, and they're a bizarre mix. You've got Shiite and Hazara. The Unity Party here has been Wadat. You've got Sunni Pashtun. You've got Sunni Uzbek. You've got Sunni Shiite non-Hazara, Sunni Tajik. It's a fairly diverse group. If you look back at the Kabul front in November of 2001, there were 5 different units approaching Kabul of the United Front or Northern Alliance. I know there's just a lot of words and numbers, but this is the power base. This is, you know, the Northern Alliance, the United Front that seized Kabul. And this gives you, these are some of the commanders, Bismillah Khan, that controlled these different brigades of Northern Alliance or United Front soldiers. In November of after this fall of Kabul, or during the fall of Kabul, during this time, there was what was called the Bonn Agreement, and the Bonn talks in Germany, where major factions got together, discussed the future of Afghanistan, and they decide, they provide a mandate to rule until a loyal jury can be convened to approve an official post-Taliban government. And of the 4 factions that were involved, the Northern Alliance over the United Front, but significantly, most of the important warlords were still fighting in the war. So they were represented, but they weren't represented, because you have to remember the United Front was anything but united. They were united in their common cause against the Taliban, but they were independent groups controlling independent portions of the country, which is still plaguing Afghanistan today. The Rome group, Peshawar group, and the Cyprus group. But most, I'm not going to say most people, but many analysts say that, you know, this is the power base right here because these guys, the United Front, Northern Alliance, they're the ones that actually won the war. The Peshawar, the Peshawar, the Rome group, the Cyprus group, they could talk all they wanted. Till the Taliban's out of there, nothing's happening. So the group that brought the power shift is the Northern Alliance, United Front. It was determined at that time in the Bonn agreements they would come up with the International Security Force for Afghanistan. It was created in January 2002, and there's a couple of its reasons: ensure transition to a stable political system, ensure the security of law and order, and to train a new Afghan security force. During its first 6 months, some of the highlights: all these joint patrols, disposed of nearly 3 million munitions, 80% of which were anti-personnel landmine. Afghanistan, it really is true. I mean, everywhere you go, there are minefields everywhere, and most of them are marked in red or white painted rocks. But it's the kind of place that if you're on a patrol, you just go to the, if you have to go to the bathroom, you just stand there and go. You never leave the trail, you never leave the line of march, you never venture off to the side of your car on any, you know, mountain road. It's just that kind of a place. So they've done a lot of good work. They also trained the 1st Battalion of the new Afghan Army, the Afghan National Guard, and then numerous humanitarian projects. Here's one of the, this was just shot 3 weeks ago. It's a British soldier overlooking, at the King's Tomb. He's overlooking Kabul, and they're just doing routine patrol, presence patrol. However, when the ISAF was created, there was a feeling at the Bonn talks that the Afghans were really leery of having another international an international security force or foreign presence controlling, you know, the legitimate use of force in the country. So there was this idea that security should be looked after by Afghans themselves, but it just wasn't really possible. Again, here's ISAF headquarters in Kabul currently, and there's a British ISAF patrol. However, since then, they've done a number of, they've expanded their mission. They've continued to do training opportunities with the Afghan National Army, but a lot of the the ANA, the training has been under the auspices of the U.S. training forces. They've taken care of primary security in Kabul. In fact, when I was there in 2002, they were only in Kabul. That was it. I mean, there was a joke, you probably all remember it, but you know, they say Karzai government, you know, he doesn't control Afghanistan, he controls Kabul, and he barely controls Kabul with the help of ISAF. I mean, that was it. He didn't have any reach. And then the cantonment of heavy weapons. These are the heavy weapon parks in Herat. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. Basically what they've done, ISAF and the U.S. Joint Task Force, is they've taken all the heavy weapons when they can get them from the different warlords, and they put them into these big parks. And what I was told is one reason they put them into these big collection points is that if all hell breaks loose in Afghanistan, they're going to just bomb the park. They're going to J-dam it, and if they ever have to withdraw, the last thing they do before they go, before these ever fall back into warlords' hands, is they're going to just blast it all. So they're collecting all the heavy weapons from all over Afghanistan and putting them in these big designated like parking lots. And if it ever, like I say, if they can't control, they lose control, they get pushed out, U.S. airstrikes will take care of all that stuff. So we don't have another arms clash with heavy weapons. I don't know if you can really see it. They've already done some of this stuff, like engineers. You can see they blew the barrel up off that. They plugged the barrel and blew it. So it's all frayed back and stuff. Yeah?
How did they get these weapons from the warlords?
We're gonna,
Warlords want to get those out.
yeah, we're going to talk about that. So we're going to mention that. That's a very good question. Like I said, they've taken responsibility for the Kabul city, Kabul, and part of that is taking care of the Kabul police. The current ISAF commander is a Turkish general, and this is kind of a PR statement from them, but that's kind of what they think this is what they want to accomplish. It's a rotating mission every 6 months. It's under a new commander, and it's been steadily evolving. They have what they call these provisional reconstruction teams, and in the beginning they were all U.S. manned. They were U.S. forces, and basically what they do is I call it a fire base, if you want to use an old Vietnam terminology, where they just create a fire base in an area, but it's different. You have a security element. You have usually lieutenant colonel who runs it, a battalion commander grade will run it. He'll have a security company. He'll have a civil affairs company, communications, logistics, things like that. They can write blank checks out to $250,000 without any approval above them for any public works projects in their area. So it's really a redevelopment initiative with a security element because it is Afghanistan. But like in the one, I was talking to one of the PRT commanders who just came home after 6 months, and he was given an artillery unit. As you know, U.S. forces are stretched kind of thin right now. Artillery unit company was designated as his security, and he said he fought with them for the first 4 months because the guy wanted to put artillery right in the dead center of camp, fanning every direction so he could blast the enemy and he goes, there's no real enemy. They're not going to come at you in waves. You're not going to be loading the artillery. Never even gave them the ammo for the artillery, that they had these howitzers in the middle of the camp. And finally they realized that they were just really a security type mission where they would escort civil affairs teams out into the countryside as they worked with local Afghans to dig wells, build schools, things like that. The checks that I say that they have the power to write, they can only write them to nationals. Foreign national companies aren't eligible for this kind of work. These have to be grassroots type things. They have to be Afghans working, like Afghan well diggers, Afghan road construction crews, things like that. Going back a little bit, you had, after the Bonn agreements, you had a transitional government. And I wanted to bring this up a little bit because it was, again, President Karzai has maintained his power throughout these different phases, but you can see some pretty illustrious guys. General Dostum, which we're going to talk about, who's probably the most important warlord in the north. Mohakik, who's probably the most important Hazara warlord in the center area, in the Bamyan region. There's no way to have a government in Afghanistan, especially during the transitional authority time period, without incorporating the warlords. And that's the story, is how do you get these warlords to work with the government? And it's really been a carrot and stick approach. Some will respond to wads of money and cabinet posts and a part of being part of the central government. Others will not, have not, and they've had fights with government forces and U.S. forces, although the U.S. has really tried to stay clear of this warlord struggle. And as you saw on that earlier slide where we had the 3 combat hunting ground boxes, that's because those are like where Taliban concentrations are. They don't have warlord issues there that are supposedly aligned to the government. They don't want to get into that fight. You don't want to step in between Osted Ata, Dostum, and Mohakik. When I was in Mazar-i-Sharif in 2002, well, when Mazar fell, there was a race for the city. And you could see this because they were trying to take the city first. The city is kind of split between Uzbeks. It's predominantly an Uzbek power base. But Osted Ata he's a Tajik who has a lot of a large constituency as well. And Mohakik was raced up there to protect the Hazara, because in the past these 3 ethnic groups had just slaughtered each other, going back and forth through the neighborhood streets, slaughtering each other in the different areas, different neighborhoods. So there was a race to gain control of the city. At the time you had a special forces operating base, and you had 2 A teams of 12 men each, and then you had some British and other elements. You didn't have a lot of U.S. forces on the ground to sort of separate the warlords. The A teams would travel. One A team traveled with Dostum the whole time. One 12-man A team traveled with Ata the whole time. Basically, play nice, coerce these guys to playing nice, working things out with each other without it resulting in bloodshed. But when I was there, the curfew was dark, and the curfew was at sunset, and sunset in November, December, January was 6. And nobody moved after 6, not even these guys. And we were stuck at one of Ata's junior commander's places one night, I remember, and I wanted to get from there to cross town. And I couldn't get them to drive me. And I said, we've got like 5 Jeeps here, a BTR, BMP, you can go. And they go, no, we can't go, because if we run into Dostum's guys, it could end up in a big fight. So even though they were the liberators of the Northern Alliance, the united front, there's a real competition between these guys amongst themselves, let alone the government. The National Defense Commission is even, more, it's filled with these warlords. In fact, another addition to this is Ismail Khan, who is, or until recently, was the ruler of Herat, the most prominent western region of Afghanistan. In fact, he, and if you read the back pages on all these guys, they're murderers, they're terrorists, they're everything. But then they were the United Front, and they needed, and they were our allies, U.S. allies. Now they're government allies. But some of them have dropped in and out of positions. I know General Dostum has dropped in and out of the government. They haven't really been able to take care of him so much. How difficult it is to maintain a government in Afghanistan, was highlighted by the assassination of the vice president in 2002, and it caused a readdressment or a reevaluation of what was going on in Afghanistan and what they can what they came up with is that, hey, the security situation is obviously fragile. Incorporating the warlords is still incredibly problematic. Some are responding, some were not. And it's just, there's problems. At the same time, like I said, they're trying to build the Afghan National Army. And on paper, the numbers look pretty good, 15,000 by the end of last year. It's supposed to be fully operational in about 5-6 years. It's not that good, in fact. It only is a light infantry. It depends on U.S. air power for movement. If you're going to do helicopter air assault, which you kind of need to if you're going to operate around the Hindu Kush, you are reliant on the U.S. Or coalition forces, somebody. They would like to become 70,000, and most of their equipment is 25 years old, and we consider it unsuitable. But what's interesting about the ANA, if you look at the first, they would graduate them in battalions. And in the early ANA battalions, they were suffering 60, 70, 80% desertion rate. And they also struggled. What would happen is warlords would send in not the brightest guys in their group to join the ANA, go through a boot camp, get some pay, a uniform, a weapon, and then they would desert back to the warlord area from which they came. So they had a difficult time retaining any of the ANA. That said, it's getting better. This idea of allegiance to the state is still difficult to define and difficult to manage. But by 2009, again, they hope to have all these different elements, so they'll look like a real modernized Western Army. And like I say, they would really like to be by 2011 to that level. But numbers aren't everything. Quality is probably more important than numbers. And just look at what the U.S. did in Afghanistan. 200 special forces guys basically toppled the whole regime with help of the Northern Alliance. So it's not numbers. So there's some work to do. They did have, in May of 2003, they came up again with they have these declarations, these different initiatives in the government, and it was signed by President Karzai and 10 provincial governors, and it was all about defining power and allowing the central government to have power. And so I just think things like this are pretty interesting. Not to interfere in the affairs of other provinces, not to hold military and civilian posts simultaneously. Again, they're trying to bring these guys in off the battlefield. And they've been on the battlefield for some of them decades. If you look at Ismail Khan, Dostum, Osted Atta, they went into exile in the Hindu Kush and the hinterland. Some went into exile in Uzbekistan like Dostum. Others were in Iran like Ismail Khan, Pakistan. But these guys these are warriors. They've never, in a sense, left the battlefield. But this is interesting too. Further, Article 11 abolishes special titles that some of the regional leaders have adopted for themselves, such as Special Envoy of the Head of State or Amir, which, Dostum called himself the Special Envoy of the Head of State. He just made it up, and that was him. And Khan was an Amir. So, the government is just struggling to control these guys. Signatories, you have Ismail Khan. He did sign it. Dostum signed it. Osted Atta signed it. Who else signed it? Well, all these guys didn't sign it, but these are some of your bigger warlords. So it was signed by a fair number of these provincial leaders. And as a carrot, offering a carrot to General Dostum, Karzai appoints him as Special Advisor on Security and Military Affairs, and he was instructed to dismantle Army Corps No. 7, which is really a bizarre twist because it was Osted Atta's unit, and Osted Atta and he had been in competition for the Mazar-i-Sharif area since the fall of the Taliban. So you can see that there's some issues. Atta does not want to be disarmed by Dostum. Okay, I have no picture there. I don't know. Provincial leaders. I don't know why I don't have they just talk about some of the provincial leaders there. All right, the provincial leaders, if you look at it, everybody talks about how Afghanistan is an ethnic checkerboard, and it's true. If you look at it, you have this green Pashtun belt right here, which, if you remember, Pashtun was the power base of the Taliban. It's also the dominant language, obviously, in this part, which is Kandahar and Kabul, the major cities, the power base for Afghanistan. And President Karzai is a Pashtun, which is probably very important. In the middle here, you have the Hazara area. Bamiyan, of course, was more famous for probably having the Taliban blow up the big Buddha statues in the cliff. That's Bamiyan. Those are the Hazaras. To give you, and then you have right up here, this is all Uzbek. And you have these purple, this is Tajik. And then over here you have the Herat area here, and you have Baluchi here. I mean, you have significant ethnic division, which is supported by a complete lack of infrastructure and a really difficult geography. If you think of the Hindu Kush mountain range tearing through the middle here, it's just, you can't drive it. And if you want to know, we drove from Kabul to Bamiyan, and it took 28, 30 hours. Should have taken 4. Now it's getting better. They have built, the Army Corps of Engineers, for many different coalition forces have been out there building roads and stuff. But I mean, if it takes you 28 hours to drive something that should be 4, you have a serious logistic and infrastructure problem. Bamiyan is, in effect, in 2002, 2003, is completely isolated from the central government. And it's like next door. But it's isolated because you can't get there. You can't bring your influence there because you can't get there. There's no trains. There's just a bumpy dirt road full of, bomb craters that you just got to navigate through, and that's it. It's getting better, but there are large portions of the country where you have no infrastructure that works, and so you have a difficult time spreading influence. Let's look at some of the warlords. This is Dostum. This is, like I say, he was an Uzbek. His power base is traditionally in the Mazar-e Sharif area. That's his party, his movement, his militia. He's switched sides more times than, you could never, it's nuts. He was on everybody's side at least once. But the bottom line, he has at least 20,000 troops estimated loyal to him. So he can determine his own future in the Mazar-e Sharif area. International Security Force, ISAF, has put a PRT. It's run by the Brits. It's in Mazar-e Sharif up here. But again, they're talking battalion strength at maximum with a company security detachment. They're not going to fight a war between these warlords. They're not going to engage if they don't have to. They're there to patrol, provide a presence, and rebuild and reconstruct the local environment. That's kind of it, and probably report back to ISAF. And so it's still pretty much his game. If he, at some point, and maybe he'll just become marginalized. Another way of reducing the power of the warlords is to marginalize them. But Mazar-e Sharif is a strategic city. Its access into Uzbekistan is important. It's on the plain. There's his primary competitor. Again, he has an interesting background. He was married to a Pashtun who was able to smuggle him out when the Taliban took over. He's a Tajik. And again, he has about, they estimate 20,000 troops. Now, I don't know who makes these estimates, whether it's the CIA or who does it, but they run around with a whole bunch of guys, and if you drive through Mazar-e Sharif, you will go through neighborhoods where you'll see hundreds and hundreds of armed men in their Toyota Hilux pickups with 50 RPGs in the back, just chilling, and that's Atta's guys. You drive across to another area of town, and you'll see the same, those Dostum's guys. You go a little bit further, you see Mohakik's guys. Now, Mohakik said he doesn't really want to have any power in Mazar-e Sharif. He just wants to protect the Hazara neighborhoods. But Mazar-e Sharif is emblematic of a lot of the problems in Afghanistan because you have rivals. And again, they don't list his power. I've never seen his power strength, his base, but it says his numbers are unknown. Part of that is because, again, the Hazaras have been very isolated. Again, Bamiyan's not far on paper, but it's might as well be across the planet trying to work with the Hazaras. It's a very poor area. Ismail Khan, he's interesting. He was the governor of Herat. Again, he controlled this western area here. He now is the new Minister of Energy. So he responded in a way to the initiatives of the government. He's the Ministry of Energy. He has a significant energy and water, I think. He also turned in all his heavy weapons. Your question about why would they turn in their heavy weapons? I don't know what finally convinced them, but the 2 weapons parks that I showed you were from Herat. And there's like 1,800 vehicles there. Those are all nominally under his control, and that's artillery, multiple rocket launch systems, tanks, armored personnel carriers, things like that, basically that. He turned them in about 7 months ago, 8 months ago. It's remarkable. I mean, it really is to take all the heavy weapons, in effect, off the streets or out of western Afghanistan. And what's really interesting is talking to some of the Joint Task Force guys that run air intelligence and the aerial reconnaissances, they will always hear from these guys, oh, we've turned in all of our weapons, but they do overflights every day, and they just plop down the satellite or the predator imagery or I don't think so. We know you have this, and we find this stuff. We know it's out there, but you still have to coerce them into turning it in, or risk open conflict to get them to take them from them. And so far, there's been a real hesitancy to do that, because you have to remember we still have the second war in the southern and eastern fringe against the Taliban. And altogether, you have about 20,000 armed soldiers in the region. You have about 8,000 ISAF and about 12,000 U.S. Joint Task Force and Coalition. The Royal Dutch Netherlands has sent another contingent of 185 special forces to work in the 3 combat hunting zones to hunt Al-Qaeda, Taliban personnel. It's not a huge force for a country as big as Afghanistan. And what's going on now, the PRT system, they built the first provisional reconstruction teams down here where they had security like Kabul, Kandahar, and they've expanded in a counterclockwise direction, opening up. The U.S. controlled Mazar-i-Sharif. They turned it over to NATO, which turned it over to now the Brits. It'll rotate in 6 months. Herat is Turkish or Bulgaria? I can't. They just turned it over, and they're trying to encompass the whole country with these provisional reconstruction teams, pumping money into the region. Again, getting these warlords to just whatever they can do to try to get them. I don't know why this picture didn't work. Okay. Well, this guy was put on the State Department terrorist list in 2003. They missed him with the Hellfire fired from a Predator. I don't have my picture of him. I'm not sure why. And now he's been in hiding. We don't know where he is, and they think he's sort of really linked up with the Taliban. Just another warlord. He doesn't really control an area, so to speak, or they don't know. It's a little more sketchy than that. It's almost like the Taliban or like Al-Qaeda, where he's just kind of their supportive elements in various places, but he's kind of off the chart. He's not in the government anywhere. They don't have a role for him, and he's just basically being hunted. So if you look at 2005, the government's changed a little bit. Ali Jalali, he was based in Washington for the last, I think, 10 years or so. Wrote some books, The Bear Went Over the Mountain, a lot of Soviet history, Soviet and Afghanistan history. Again, the energy minister, Ismail Khan, which is probably the most significant warlord to fully engage, leave Herat, move to Kabul, give up his heavy weapons. Khalili, again, these guys were all involved in the Northern Alliance, the United Front. So, and if you look at it, he's a Hazara, he's a Tajik, he's a Pashtun. I think Karzai and him and Wardak are the only Pashtuns. It's a very fragile ethnic mix and trying to incorporate into the government. We see the same thing going on in Iraq, same thing, generally, trying to put together a new government, try to incorporate Shias, Kurds, and Sunnis. What's the mix? What will work? What will provide enough representation so that you can maybe stop the insurgency side of each of those ethnic groups from just continuing on the insurgency? Finally, the final blow, probably to the warlord's problem, is the narcotics trade in Afghanistan. The Army the armed forces, Joint Task Force has come out a number of times said we are not going after narcotics. They had a bumper crop in 2003, the largest crop in, I think, almost in years. They're growing poppy everywhere. The predominantly area, I think I got a different, here's the statistics. Here's a set of statistics. You look at 2003, it's totally skyrocketed. When the war came, it had really dropped. Just prior to the war, it was at its highest. It's climbing again. It's the only economy in Afghanistan.
Why can't they just main bomb or agent orange these schools?
They could do that. The Army has said that they're not going to get involved in counter narcotics operations. They know it's out there. They photograph it every day. Part of it is there's been statements. I don't know if there's an official policy why, but there's been numerous statements from CENTCOM commanders and other people, and the gist of it that I get is this: one thing at a time. It's the only economy in Afghanistan right now. It does strengthen the power of the warlords because they're able to take money to raise troops and weapons and this and that and the other, but at the same time, it's the only thing really feeding anybody. And so they want to take care of they've introduced some different types of wheat in different areas that are supposed to grow in these high plateaus. It's going to be a transitional, that's the way, they are starting to bring in drug enforcement agency people from our country and from others to try to tackle it, but they're just not going out and burning it and destroying it all because they think, my feeling is they think it'll cause more chaos than it's worth right now. let's get Afghanistan going, and let's eradicate this problem little by little. Now, whether that's a smart policy, I don't know, but that's kind of been the policy, because everybody knows that poppy, and the biggest growers of poppy have been the Northern Alliance. That's been part of the problem. If you look at during the Taliban time, one reason poppy production stayed so high is the Northern Alliance, our allies, they grew all this poppy here and took it right out through Tajikistan, which is the other part of the problem. I mean, this is Central Asia. I don't even know if I can give an example, but this is anything but a secure border. There's a Russian motorized rifle brigade manning it, which up until the last few years has been completely morally and financially bankrupt and take everything they can from the drug trade, just to survive and eat. You have issues, it's a free border. So, and there's a lot of outside players that make money off drugs too in the region, so it's really difficult. But as you can see, a significant region was in the Northern Alliance area. I don't know why my picture didn't work. They have called a new Minister of Counter Narcotics. Again, they're trying to address the problem, but it's going to be really slow, in my opinion, to be addressed. I mean, there's so many other problems. I mean, they're just trying to get trucking going in Afghanistan, but they don't have a road that you can drive across the country in less than like 5 days. They've cut the times down. I just saw a chart the other day that the Joint Task Force issued where they put drive times in all the major cities, and it's gone down by like a factor of 3 since 2002. So they are building better roads, and better means of transportation, but it's going to take a while. Basically, just to review the cultural ethos of the warlord, he's not committed to the state. They shift alliances. Afghanistan is probably more famous for shifting alliance than any place that I can remember, especially in modern history. When we were here at Kala Jungi in this fortress, the commander of the Northern Alliance that was there fighting those foreign Taliban in the fortress had been a Taliban 2 weeks earlier. And I asked him, well, we talked, well, what do you mean you're a Taliban? He goes, yeah, no problem. And they all know me. They know I was a good guy, I'm like, okay. And he was commanding all the Northern Alliance troops, killing these other, in this fight. And he had been a Taliban. There's this tradition of changing sides. And it happens a lot. Changing hats, they call it. It's different for foreigners. To the knife is a statement they use, which is, I think, is why it was easier to engage in Kala Jungi and fight this battle between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance to kill each other off, because that group were all foreigners. They have a tendency to bond together against a greater common enemy, but usually they act in their own interest, and that's still what we see today. And this is not, Afghanistan is emblematic, or it's the same way in places like Chechnya, for instance. We have, right now you just have a handful of warlords or military commanders, and probably only one who's well known after the death of Muscatov 2 months ago. But people rally around the warlords. Russians have been trying to figure out, or at least they say they know, but I think they're trying to figure out who has power in Chechnya. The fact is probably nobody has power in Chechnya, of Chechen power, just as President Karzai may control Kabul, and his grip is growing in places like Herat now because he's been able to incorporate Ismail Khan into the government. It's a black hole, Mazar-i-Sharif. Friends of mine in the 7th group came back from a little recon up there a few weeks ago, and they said, man, that's Indian country up there. And there's no central control in that area. That's what they feel. The Brits at the PRT, they just, talk to them, they go, oh, the weather's nice, but they kind of avoid the issue. I mean, it's Indian country. In other words, it's not under the central government's control. So, and so, I guess just a basic obvious conclusion is they will continue to challenge until they were able to incorporate all these warlords in there, shut down the opium crops, the poppy production, at least minimize it, start taking away the financial strength of the warlords. They realize they have to do this, but they can't just try to eradicate it all. It'll end in open warfare in many places. Plus, it's another way of fighting. Getting back to your question, why don't they do it? To directly go after the opium production in many parts of Afghanistan would be to basically say, I'm going to go to war with you, General Dostum, I'm going to go to war with you because they're controlling the crop. So again, do you want to go to war, a direct confrontation, or do you want to try to bring them in a carrot and stick approach, and hopefully more carrots than sticks? Yeah.
You mentioned the wheat with respect to, some economical factors. What other economical factors are underway to move away from the old to more of a new?
There's all kinds, but everybody's on the ground. There's a lot of NGOs, there's a lot of reconstruction, a lot of development. This whole PRT system where you have to actually use Afghan personnel to rebuild the country. There are a lot of projects underway to rebuild everything from basic water, sewage, roads, power, grids, everything. I don't know about just other, like an introduction of like a cash crop like this that would continue once the reconstruction is done. I'm sure there are things. I just, off the top of my head, if I said it, I'm probably just going to guess it based on what I think I know, and so I'll get it wrong, so I probably shouldn't say. But that's basically all I had today. I did have a short clip. It's about 5 minutes. It's just the ISAF guys patrolling in Kabul. There's no words to it. We can watch it if you want to, or we can just open it up to questions. You guys want to see it? Just get a sense of what it's like driving around Kabul. Well, I will point out one thing while it stops. I don't know why it's doing that. See that bar right there? Kind of see that bar? The Taliban or anti-coalition forces would hang wire, and they hung a wire and cut a guy in half as he went down the road. So they put that bar up there so the bar will cut the wire, because they lost that one guy. It's a new addition to all the patrols in Kabul on all the vehicles. So I don't know why it's not playing, but anyhow, it's not playing. So that's really the conclusion of my lecture. Anybody have any questions or comments or anything you want to discuss? Yeah.
What's the climate region like? Are they able to, is the soil good enough to begin wheat and all that kind of stuff?
That's not my area of expertise, obviously. I would say that it's probably not that great in most places. I mean, oh man, I want to go back to my map. This doesn't really show it. I mean, the climate, for one, I can say, is obviously diverse, and there's lots of things you can look that up. But I mean, if you consider that you have the Hindu Kush mountain range cutting through here, you have a plain here, which makes it, very. It's a coveted area. I mean, Mazar-i-Sharif is a central city in Afghanistan for a reason. But obviously, in these mountains, they're snow-capped most of the year, completely impassable in different parts of the year. It's just different, and I don't know exactly where they're even trying to test these wheat crops out. I don't know. I've just heard from different people that are trying to introduce these kind of things to convince these farmers to start shifting. But they're not going to make as much money off wheat, so. Yeah.
You said you want to talk about anti-Taliban and anti-Al-Qaeda operations. You said there's about 12,000 allied troops.
Yes.
Has that always been the case, or has that number been higher at some times? Or
I don't know if it's been.
Clearly, it's not doing the job to eradicate Al-Qaeda. Do you know, has that always been the case, or has it been higher before?
I don't know if it's been higher. The real question is what the mix is from combat personnel to non-combat personnel. That I don't know at the time. For instance, they're getting Bagram Air Base ready to handle F-16s. They're trying to redo the airstrip. There's been a big debate. Do we even need F-16s in Afghanistan? I don't know. You can project your combat power, but why can't A-10 do it, or why can't different things like that? The mix of forces, what's going on, it's hard to say. I don't know what that mix is right now. It's constantly shifting.
Does the Army seem like it has a real intention of eradicating Al-Qaeda?
Oh, the Army units themselves are trying. Oh yeah, they're definitely trying to do it. They, but it's a big country. I mean, I have my own personal opinions on this. One, like when we were in, we were right over here in Operation Anaconda, and it was well known they were going back and forth into Pakistan. And people say, okay, Pakistan's not serious about it. And there's a report on NPR yesterday from a CIA officer who's just recently retired who just said, yeah, the Pakistan government's protecting Osama, or elements in Pakistan are protecting Osama. I don't know if it's a government thing, because if you, what President Musharraf has said in Pakistan, that this area here, they don't even have administrative control over it. This is long before, this is not like a post-Taliban issue, which I think is a really point remembering. It's kind of like Tajikistan. This is Central Asia. He's saying they don't have control of this region. They never had it. So if they don't have it, anybody can go up there. So I know we have special ops units crawling around in and out of there, although they're not supposed to be operating in Pakistan, but you got a lot of territory to cover. I mean, the units themselves, of course, they're serious, on the ground, because they go after their mission, and they're flying predators over every single day, and they go after the intel. It's hard to operate in these areas. I mean, if you look at Iraq and Syria, we've got an entire, at least one brigade of Marines, or if not two, controlling the Syrian border, and it's not near as mountainous, as porous as this, and insurgents flow in and out of Syria all the time. And the Marines took more hits on the Syrian border this last 6-month deployment than any other place in Iraq. Border is just kind of hard to patrol.
So with more troops help as well?
More of the right troops, probably. But Special Operations Command is still taking the lead in Afghanistan, and they're taxed beyond. I mean, guys I know have been on stop loss now 3 times in a row, or like stop loss in 3 deployments. They're like in their mid-40s, and they're complaining like, I got it. Why am I doing this still? But they're not letting them out. So it could. Full access into Pakistan, but it's politically sensitive in Pakistan, very politically sensitive. You can't just if you march a bunch of U.S. troops into Pakistan, the government will fall, in my opinion. If the government falls in Pakistan, then you have 2 problems. So they're probably going to live with the fact. Now, I saw in the news they've been incorporating, they just recently incorporated, I think, 4 senior Taliban officials, or they've offered them amnesty. So they're also offering this sort of carrot-stick approach. And I don't, I just saw something on the news just yesterday. I didn't have a chance to even digest it or look at it. But
As far as the warlords go, when you're trying to build a government in this country, you're trying to incorporate these warlords, which are trying to keep the country apart, keep their control of their regions. Why don't they take out the warlords and then build a government?
the government came to power on the warlords. The government has no independent army. They are trying to build the ANA. If the Afghan National Army was 70,000 hardcore troops, yeah, they could go up to General Dostum, fight it out, probably win the battle, and then rebuild Mazar. But the government's dependent on the warlords for its military power, for the legitimate use of force. That's the problem. And the warlords aren't going to succumb to each other. They're not going to willingly give in most cases. I think it's remarkable that Ismail Khan came over. And I'm not saying he's not a saint by any stretch, but the fact that he at least has made these, and he could go back on his word tomorrow and head back out to Herat and try to regain all his heavy weapons again. And it's just difficult. It's just they don't have the power. You look at Dostum, 20,000. Atta, 20,000. Mohakik, assume he has 10. 50,000 in their home neighborhood. Which force is going to go up and do that? And that's a battle the U.S. has not wanted to get into.
So is this like, you're talking about the Afghans having their own military by 2011?
Yeah, they have their own military now. They want to be fully functional by 2011, yeah.
So would that be, would they be in a position then to get these warlords neutralized?
It depends if they can develop this idea of allegiance to state. Right now, your allegiance is to your tribe or affiliation or to your region or to your warlord, and that's been the biggest problem. Because the warlords are sending troops. They've been asked to send troops or send people down, and they've all sent troops down. But then they all come back and desert or do their time, walk back, and they have more trained troops, and they go back to work with Dostum. So it's been kind of, you're going to have to make life better for the Afghanis to say, hey, life is better under the central government where democracy is better than warlord rule. I have power, I have food, I have a job. I think, personally, you're going to have to build up all those civil affairs aspects of the war in order to get the Afghans to say, this government works. And if this government works, I'm not going to hang my hat with Dostum or Atta or Khan or any of these guys. And that is a long-term, that's a real long-term nation-building effort. But it's gonna, I think it's going to be very long-term.
Do you think, with your ideas right there, do you think that's more, instead of like a 5-year plan, more of a 30-year plan?
Oh, certainly.
Because you gotta,
It'll be decades.
some of these kids that already got that mindset of, well, I've got to follow the warlord.
Well, and I think in different parts, there's lots of different examples around the former Soviet sphere. You hear, I used to hear people, kids and like college kids say that it'll be them, hopefully they can really truly understand democracy and central in a government. They think that generation of their parents will have to die off because it's a system they know. Maybe look at the next generation, as for Dostum and those guys. Hopefully it doesn't take that long. But Afghanistan's always been that way. I mean, more or less. Do you have a question?
I was just wondering, the alliances between the warlords, under what circumstances are there ever any formed? I mean,
Under what circumstances are they formed?
yeah.
Well, oh
are
man.
they strictly competing for control of the opium in the
Oh,
regions? Or is it an ethnic barrier?
I couldn't even say. I mean, like I say, Dostum's sided with the Taliban, sided with Massoud, the old Tajik leader of the Northern Alliance. He sided with Atta at times. He's taken the Hazars under his wings. He went back and went to the Taliban. I mean,
It's not really clear.
it's not clear. And again, they're acting in their own self-interest, and so I don't know what their self-interest probably changes from time to time. And so it could be any number of factors which would cause warlords to link up or to separate from themselves. It was hoped that Dostum, being the special envoy of security or whatever to the government, it would help and he did. He went down to Kabul. He did his meetings here and there, but he just couldn't do it. So he went back up to, somebody else. Yeah.
How does the company get access to these areas? And if one of your films was not upon by the forces that be, would that access be limited?
Oh, our company. We just we just go out there. At this point, we have a lot of contacts in different militaries, and so we use them when we can. But the first time into the region, I went by myself, and we just crossed the border from Uzbekistan on my own and met some guys from like this 5th Special Forces Group and 10th Mountain Division, and it's kind of that way all over. And then you try to just, like anything, you just try to work well with different people, and they remember you. And so we sometimes get calls like, hey, you should really come, that we're going to do something interesting or whatever. I went to school in England. That didn't hurt me with British contacts, and so I have a number of Ministry of Defense contacts. So the British, in fact, like I think if we do actually go in 3 weeks down to the southern Afghanistan on this for some special ops mission, I'm then going to go up to Mazar-i-Sharif and live at the PRT for about a week or two, and just utilize some contacts I have in the British, But if not, we know people at the ISAF headquarters at NATO, As far as the films go, frankly, I don't even, half the time they never even see them. And most of the time, honestly, it's just boring. I mean, covering combat is about 90% boredom and 1% fire, like intensity battle. Covering things like reconstruction, you're going to go out with the civil affairs team and watch them hand out blankets or design a new canal or irrigation ditch. And if you get fired upon, their security element will return fire, and it might end up in a firefight. But there's, it's just hard for me. I can't even really, I mean, certainly there are circumstances of things where they might be a little, they don't want to film, like for instance, special forces. They don't want their faces plastered with their identities. So whenever you shoot those guys, if you're marching with them or you're patrolling through a mountain, you can shoot the back of them all you want, or profile of you. But that's just part of the SOCOM creed, that you're not going to just get up in their face and the guys can say, hey, I'm Colonel so-and-so, and today they just don't do it. So you're not even going to be able to take that shot. Or if you do, we've done that occasionally, but usually, and it just depends. You just work it out with the guys on the ground. At Mazar-i-Sharif, we worked it out with the guys on the ground. They were fine. They didn't care. And we filmed them, and it's really weird. So Special Operations Command was not thrilled about the idea of having their guys shot and their faces and names identified. Yet a year ago, National Geographic was working with SOCOM to do a film, and so they called us up and said, can we use all that footage for National Geographic? So then they were so thrilled about having the footage. And so it's kind of it just kind of goes in like that. But short of somebody committing like atrocities or this or that, which I haven't seen anything I would consider an atrocity, but we filmed everything and we've had nothing restricted. And they don't restrict anything. If anything, they might just, I just can't imagine. 10th Mountain guy kicked us out of his group in Anaconda he just didn't want anybody with the camera, but he just politely just booted us out. So we just walked across the valley to the 101st, and they were happy. They didn't care. So I didn't get to shoot anything. So that was the way I guess they contained me from, or restricted my access there. Yeah.
Can you tell us your perspective on what happened with Michael Spann and the prisoner revolt, and how that played into those different operations that were going on?
Well, the thing about the Span, man, that seems kind of interesting, because I'm not even sure if that's a strategic moment in the war, but it galvanized the U.S. in a sense because, well, I happened upon it, just pure luck, filmed it all, pumped it out, and so it was probably, at the time, everyone said it was the first combat footage of the war. So it had a galvanizing effect on public opinion because this is the first time you got to see people get shot. A lot of bodies. But the Span thing, I'm not really sure. Dostum and Atta and those guys, they were in Kunduz, which is over in this area here. Because Kunduz was the last major city to fall. And they were there for, I call it the great land grab. They were warlords. They wanted their share slice of control of the north, so they went to Kunduz, which left a little bit like a screening force of these prisoners here. So the prisoners revolted. They killed a bunch of the Northern Alliance. They killed this Johnny Spann, whatever his name was, Spann. And both the A teams from the Special Forces Forward Operating Base were in Kunduz with the two warlords. So the Forward Operating Base scraped together a B team. They just scraped it together. They just abandoned the Forward Operating Base and came out to defend the fort to try to recover the CIA guy's body. That's kind of how it went down. The battle lasted for 3 days. I always joke that it lasted for 3 days because it was a typical Northern Alliance fight, and I don't mean anything disrespectful, but I mean, if it would have been a Western Army, it would have been over in a few hours. I mean, Northern Alliance commanders are beating their soldiers down, beating them with a stick to go down and actually fight and engage the Taliban in the courtyard. Nobody wanted to get down the courtyard and fight it out tree by tree, house by house. But I'm not really sure if that really, it was well publicized, but at the same time, I'm not really sure if it was really strategic. I mean, Tora Bora would have been Operation Anaconda, the seizing of Camp Rhino in the beginning by the Marines. It may have had more strategic impact on the conflict there. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but I honestly don't know what major impact it had. Do you think there's any impact for Khal Jungi? I mean, everybody knows about it, but I'm not sure that.
Did the warlords have any ties to Osama bin Laden? In relation, I mean, you said that one of those leaders, was with the Taliban 2 weeks earlier. And I'm
Sure.
wondering, what their feelings are or ties to Osama bin Laden.
It's so hard to say. Intel, in my opinion, is very spotty. Whatever the U.S. says, I think Intel's totally spotty there. I don't think it's that conclusive. And guys like Dostum, who changed sides both times, whether they ever met Osama, I have no idea. It's just really hard to gain accurate intelligence from that part of the world. And people are suspect. I mean, we just did, a film on Chechnya for the Beyond the Border series, and we wanted to interview mujahideen, Islamic jihadist fighters, who knew how Khattab, the main character is Khattab or Shamil. We didn't want to interview a Russian commander in an intelligence unit up in Moscow, because obviously they could tell all the reasons they hate him. But to actually find people who fought with them that I, as an American, could talk to is really difficult. We know these guys exist. We know some fighters in Turkey, this and that, but it's not that easy to walk into one of those neighborhoods and, frankly, come out alive. Plus, they're all out on the State Department terrorist list anyway, so you have issues. It's hard to get a Western, an open source view of that. It's hard to say.
You mentioned there was 12,000 U.S. soldiers along with 8,000 British.
U.S. and coalition. I think the numbers, and it shifts all the time because units are constantly getting deployed, so I haven't kept up on it to this month, but I think it's like 8,000 U.S., 4,000 coalition. I mentioned the Royal Dutch Netherlands unit of 185, so there's lots of little pieces.
Now, what is the, you mentioned a PR, you said this is a PR.
PRT?
No, you just you're kind of making a kind of a shot at it. This is their public relations comment, but really behind the scenes, this is probably not what they're doing. So what do you see that the United States is really, I mean, the United States might PR, like, this is what we're doing, but what do you see that the United States is really doing? Like, why are we there? Like, what is the real purpose of this?
Well, I think we really are rebuilding, taking the lead in rebuilding Afghanistan, which again, it depends what you think about. Is that the U.S. role to be nation building around the world? A lot of people in this country think it's not. A lot of people in the world, even more people in the world think it's not. I can't say anything bad, frankly, in rebuilding Afghanistan. I mean, the Taliban was a pretty repressive regime. And the Northern Alliance, left to their own devices, would just amount to continual civil war, multiple-sided civil war. So I think it's a really good effort to try to bring an area that's riddled with conflict and tribalism and into the sort of the framework of states, or this group of states, functioning states. I don't think it's bad. And I think the U.S. has tried to get coalition partners to go with them because we don't sort of see it, so the world doesn't see it as a unilateral attempt. Because the U.S., like I say, nation building, especially when it comes to the U.S., it's kind of a dirty word around, especially in Europe and places like that. But they are really rebuilding. They're pumping tons of money in there. If a lieutenant colonel who controls a battalion, who controls a PRT, can write as many blank checks as he wants, up to $250,000, as many as he wants, he doesn't even have to have any senior level approval. If it comes to $500,000, he has to go to his colonel, brigade commander. If it's $1 million, they have to go to division task force provider. But if they can write those kind of checks and only give them to Afghan units, you can say two things about it. One is they're certainly serious about pumping the money into the region. Obviously, it's a region up for grabs. There will be people ripping the system off. There'll be people, I'm not saying them, but locals. There'll be people who take advantage of the situation. But it doesn't mean the system isn't good in its idea. It's just it's a work in progress. So.
How much does it have to do with finding bin Laden?
Oh well. Like I say, I don't think the PRT directly in this part of the country has anything to do with bin Laden, except, again, make it a functioning, working state so the Taliban or the likes of the Taliban can never come back, erode Osama's power base, and if he has to live in exile up here in the middle of this unadministered region in Pakistan, then so be it. I mean, that's the same thing we face in Iraq, too. The idea is we went out and spoke to the 3rd Brigade Combat Team, and we were trying to figure out how do you stop the insurgency. And you want to separate the insurgents from the population. And how do you do that? If the insurgency has a friendly population that they can mix with, you will never end the insurgency. The only chance you have is the population has to decide, I'm not on the insurgent side, I'm on the government side, or I'm on the other side. And so that's why the PRT, indirectly, they're completely related to the fight for Osama. It's the fight for control of the state. If you deny Osama the territory because the state functions under the Karzai government or whoever the government is in 10 or 15 years, this is not a ground that someone like Osama can hang out for a decade and build strength. You've denied him one more place in the world to have access. So in that sense, in the long-term battle, I think it's a positive step. But I mean, are they directly hunting Osama? No.
So
These guys, no.
Going to prevent terrorism?
It's to build the country. And to build the country, hopefully, will prevent the kind of terrible conditions in which terrorism grows and expands. Yeah.
Having listened to you speak, I gain a greater appreciation for the fact that this is a work in progress, and it's not something that's going to happen next year. It's going to happen in decades. And human nature being what it is, we're a little impatient. We don't
Sure.
see that immediate return on investment,
Yeah.
And this is a region that certainly isn't going to see that anytime immediate.
No, I totally agree. If you're looking for a solution this year, next year, it's not going to happen. But is it better than it was? Having walked in Kabul, Mazar, and Kandahar, and lots of different places, it's way better than it was in '98 under Taliban control. In not just for women, men, everybody. And so, but again, there's a clash of cultures there as well. There are a lot of people that aren't Taliban who are looking at this Western ways and women in the government and things like this that are like, this is challenging the old ways of thinking in some of the older, more, different genres of Islam. So there's a lot of battles going to go on, ideological battle, and all kinds of things, yeah.
Going back to the money situation, as it goes towards building the country, well, is the foundation strong enough to hold what we're trying to build on it?
Well, the foundation is being built. That's what we're trying to build, I think, is the foundation. I mean, it's, like I say, it's a work in progress. Karzai could be assassinated tomorrow. Would the government collapse? I don't think it would collapse now. In 2002, during the Transitional Authority, it possibly would have completely collapsed. At this point, it's probably stable enough to survive assassination, and the vice president, there's, I think, 3 vice presidents, the first vice president would move into that slot. That's not obviously not what we're looking to have. Nobody wants, I don't know if nobody wants to happen, but I'm not saying we should assassinate or it will be, but I think it's an example of there is a progression, there is a bit of stability. So those are the foundations trying to.
We'll come from an ignorant point of view, like you
Not at
mentioned,
all.
so I wouldn't know anything about that, but I look around at all the things I've seen, like pictures and stuff, and it's really, when you're telling me you're dumping, you know, 250, lots of money into this country, and I'm looking at the size, I'm like, okay, I know they've got a good drug system going on. They don't have any agriculture, no, you know, energy.
Well, they have a lot of agriculture. It's growing the wrong stuff.
It's just
So.
like they don't really have a strong foundation. Where's all this money, what's this money going to? Like, is it kind of like a bribery towards the citizens? Like, hey, look, we can offer you this, or what?
I think it depends. I mean, it could be both. If you pay someone to go out and dig wells, like in the one, my friend who just ran a PRT down the south, he wrote out checks. The biggest check he wrote out for all the wells they were digging was about $8,000, which a well digger would come in with his equipment, dig for 3, 4, 5, however many days. If it was bad, they broke a bit, he would pay the money to replace that bit. That money was not a bribe, that was purely a jobs program. And it brought water to that village. Some of these villages have never had running water. I mean, most of them don't in the hinterland. They'll still taking water from the stream, you know, like.
That's what you have to compare the progress against, not against Manhattan or
Yeah,
Las Vegas or something like that. We're at Wesley. It's the fact that these people are getting services that they never had.
Yeah, and at the same time, there is some bribery going on. There's been money. I've sat on a C-130 planes going into Bagram, a guy with a briefcase with $1 million in it. And I go, where's that going? He goes, who knows? Some warlord over in Coast. Now, you could say it's to help him build his forces because he's on our side, to arm the allies, to, you know, because again, the Afghan National Army is also a work in, everything's a work in progress in Afghanistan. The Army's a work in progress. I mean, until you get guys that go through this boot camp, come up through the officer, establish an officer chain of command who say, okay, man, I've been in the ANA 5 years. I'm now a lieutenant colonel, or I'm a major, or I'm a, you know, I see some vested interest in like making my unit the best unit it can be because I want to be the defense minister in 20 years, or because this is important to the state, or because as that happens, it'll strengthen that institution. And that's going to have to happen across all institutions all over Afghanistan. And it's a never-ending process. We still do it here in the United States. Every institution, you know, every party, I mean, you know, you move forward or you get left behind kind of thing, and it's, you know, it's just an ongoing effort.